Okay, this is Dr. Ben back again to give you another presentation on junk science. For those of you who don't know who I am a nuclear physicist turned software developer for most of my career. And I was an industrial controls engineer for several years, and now I'm back to being a college professor. And back when I was still working as a software engineer and a controls engineer, I would do these talks to feed my teaching bug. And so I still keep it up from time to time. And we're off to talk about junk science. So, what is junk science? Junk science is said to be faulty scientific data and analysis used to advance specific interests and hidden agendas. Often those agendas are rooted in little more than fear of the unknown or misplaced dogma. We explore and debunk many of the bizarre notions that are now made popular by the internet, as well as any number of cable media outlets. While poking fun at a number of these beliefs, the damaging impact and alarming consequences of this type of thinking is discussed. As the saying goes, be open-minded, but not to the point that your brains fall out. And that is indeed the problem. Junk science was actually a term used, I first heard years ago by a fellow named Stephen Malloy, who was a opinion writer, I believe, for Fox News, if I remember correctly. It was 20 years ago. But I liked the term. And unfortunately, it's all too apropos in the state of social media and the internet. Things that sound like science and aren't, and don't really follow the scientific method or any kind of real scientific approach or even logical approach, can be referred to as junk science. Caution, being wrong is not the same as being guilty of junk science. People make mistakes. If you draw a conclusion based on specious data, that's not necessarily junk science. That's reasonable. People make mistakes. It's usually, when people, wrong science becomes junk science only when it's obvious or easily determined flaws are ignored, and it is then used to advance some special interest. So there's usually some hidden agenda in it. That's usually how you tell it's junk science. Lots of people, unfortunately, have gotten involved and can be blamed for this, and it only seems to be getting worse over time. The media, personal injury lawyers, social and political activists, the government itself, businesses, politicians, and occasionally individual scientists who have an agenda to push. Mostly just individuals who, well, let's just say, want to sound smarter than they are, maybe a little less mean, but just as apropos. They want to come across as experts without actually putting the time in or getting the training to be an expert, whatever it is they're claiming to be expert in. I think in the old days, we used to call that charlatans. Always, when discussing anything, Occam's razor is a good thing to apply. Occam's razor is a problem-solving principle attributed to William of Occam, who was an English Franciscan friar and scholastic philosopher and theologian. The principle can be interpreted as stating, among competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be the one that's selected. Always go with the simplest explanation. By the way, I usually try not to overdo my presentations. I usually try to keep it light on the slides. Usually try to keep it around 25 slides. That leaves people, when you're in an interactive environment, that leaves people, time for questions and answers and interacting with you, so if they don't like something you say, they can go, hey, what about this? When I first wrote this talk, I had to stop at 50 slides. So there's no way in hell we'll cover all of this in one setting. I'll try to focus on the good stuff. I'll try to gloss over the stuff that's pretty obvious, but you might have to forgive me if I start, rushing through slides at the end or something, or just skipping slides altogether. Unfortunately, this is a very rich field of discussion. I wish it wasn't. I wish there wasn't quite so much junk science to talk about, but there is. This slide actually comes from my other talk about false beliefs that I did a long time ago. This is just a picture of the Hubble deep field picture that it took. And why does it matter? The reason it matters is the real universe is rich and interesting enough place for anybody, even without the BS. So if you want to have something to wonder at and believe in, there's plenty of real science out there and plenty of real data to work with. You don't have to buy into bullshit or make stuff up. And that's one of the things that's particularly infuriating to me whenever I have to deal with this on the Ask Dr. Ben page, or just talking to a student in class. And I guess the other thing, like put down there at the bottom of this slide, is we all like to be entertained. If you want to believe in bullshit, knock yourself out, but don't drag the rest of us into it and waste our time. The other thing that's important to talk about, in these discussions about conspiracy theories and junk science and fake news and all this other stuff, is confirmation bias. And so this was one of my favorite memes from early on, causality versus correlation. And this pretty much says it all. It's a picture of a dog, and it says, of course, I believe in the power of barking. The only reason I'm alive today is because of barking. Every day a mailman approaches my home, and every day I bark until he leaves. To this day, he has still not brutally murdered my entire family. I have the power of barking to thank for that. And this is exactly what a lot of people do. They're just like this dog. They think that they bark and make a bunch of noise, and that actually solves some sort of problem, when in reality, it's not that. The mailman was never out to kill you in the first place. So we start with chemtrails. I cannot tell you how many times I've already heard this BS on the internet, and I just cannot believe people buy into it, but clearly they do. According to the chemtrail conspiracy theory, long-lasting trails left in the sky by high-flying aircraft are chemicals or biological agents deliberately sprayed for sinister purposes undisclosed to the general public. They often claim it's mind control. Believers in the theory argue that normal contrails dissipate relatively quickly, and contrails that do not dissipate must contain additional substances. These arguments have been dismissed by the scientific community. Such trails are normal water-based contrails, or condensation. They're routinely left by high-flying aircraft under certain atmospheric conditions. Although proponents have attempted to prove that the claimed chemical spraying does take place, their analyses have been flawed or based on misconceptions. Because of the widespread popularity of the conspiracy theory, official agencies have received many inquiries from people demanding an explanation. Scientists and government officials around the world have repeatedly needed to confirm that supposed chemtrails are in fact normal contrails. So this is kind of how it started with this photograph here. Photographs of barrels installed in the passenger space of an aircraft for flight test purposes have been claimed to show aerosol dispersion systems. Mind you, this is an empty jet that's not carrying passengers according to this initial theory, right? Because we all know the airlines fly around empty jets, because they're not worried about profit. They're burning all that jet fuel for nothing. So anyway, here's the empty cabin of a jet claimed to show aerosol dispersion systems. The real purpose of the barrels is to simulate the weight of passengers or cargo. The barrels are filled with water, and the water can be pumped around to change the center of gravity of the aircraft while it's in flight and to make sure that it's stable. But, I guess that explanation is not nearly as exciting as all those tanks being full of chemicals, mind control chemicals, no less. So here's an example of things that people might mistake for chemtrails that are clearly not chemtrails. The one on the far left is my absolute favorite. These are contrails, steam out of 4 Wright 1820 radial engines on the B-17 bombers. Sorry, not steam, the contrails that stream out of the 4 Wright 1820 radial engines on these B-17 bombers during World War II. The thing that I love most about this picture is that you can literally see the spinning props in this compressed air that is now called to water to come out. So it's not even a jet. You can leave these contrails with propellers, with powerful enough propeller craft. And you usually don't want them, which we'll see in the next slide. The next picture, the middle picture, is a KLM 747. It's leaving distinct contrails in its wake as it flies over Russia. Definitely not a chemtrail there, it's just a standard contrail. And the third picture is the Saudi 777 dumping fuel over New York after declaring an emergency. So occasionally planes do have to dump their fuel, to get the aircraft down to a safe landing weight. The fuel disperses and evaporates before hitting the ground. The Wright engines are particularly interesting to me. So there's a whole lot. I won't read everything to you, so don't worry. But it's a standard process. One of the things that you realize when you burn fuel is, if you burn fuel efficiently in an engine, most of your byproducts are water. You're taking these hydrocarbons, you're breaking them up in some explosive process. They're mixing with oxygen. And so a lot of what you get out of these explosive processes are H2O. Now, in addition to that being a combustion product with any good efficient burning process, it's also just pushing the water vapor out of the air when you compress the air. So some of these pictures are absolutely beautiful in my mind. So you've got a couple, I've got your rotary prop picture there of your chemtrails again. And let's just point out that it's not something you would really even want if you could affect it. This water, seemingly innocuous, became lethal in the Second World War for the crews of the Boeing B-17 bomber. The 4 Wright turbocharged engines in the B-17 allowed it to climb above 30,000 feet. The humid exhaust of the engines quickly froze in the minus 40-degree air. Temperatures become significantly colder at higher altitudes, leaving long white clouds behind the bombers, indicating their presence and precise location to the German fighters. The safety of being at altitude was compromised by these telltale condensation trails or contrails. So it doesn't have to be a jet engine doing it, and most plane designers, for a lot of reasons, would rather not have them if they could help it. And by the way, if you had a chemical dispersal system and you were flying along at 500 miles an hour or something like that, you could actually do a lot better job of not making it visible than having to leave behind a bunch of contrails or chemtrails while you're doing it. The other pictures are your standard fighter jets breaking the sound barrier. So you literally see this water vapor coming out from the shock wave as this thing is blowing through the Mach barrier and leaving these angular shock waves coming off the planes. That's actually the wave front where the water vapor is forming. It's a beautiful thing. I hate to see it. I hate to see something so cool, corrupted by, the suggestion that, they're chemicals or something. It's just a different type of cloud being formed by pressure. What's the cause of the error? Well, it's usually things that everybody has, but you wish they didn't. Fear, coupled with attention seeking and distrust of authority. So this is total bullshit. That's why the bull's there. And it's not happening, and it's great to believe that, the airlines can't be trusted, the government can't be trusted, but it really is a waste of time. And it's really kind of pitiful that people spend their mental energy worrying about this kind of stuff. But other than just basic fear, there's something else going on here. We live in the internet age and people like attention. And so they come up with this crap for us all to listen to. And a lot of them, I've unfortunately learned from experience, kind of subscribe to the any attention is better than no attention, even if it's bad attention. So even if it's somebody calling you a dumbass, they still crave it and they still kind of want it, and I've seen it happen time and time again on several podcasts. It's amazing, but all fame is good in the minds of a lot of people. On to the flat earth. By the way, I recently saw a documentary, Chasing the Curve, I believe is the name of it, about the Flat Earth Society. If you haven't seen it, you need to watch it, because it's done in a really clever way. The people that were in the documentary don't even realize just how much the guy doing the documentary is kind of making fun of them, and it's subtle, so it's worth watching. The flat Earth premise: members of the Flat Earth Society claim to believe that the Earth is flat. Walking around on the planet's surface, it looks and feels flat, so they deem all evidence to the contrary, such as satellite photos of Earth as a sphere, to be fabrications of a round Earth conspiracy, orchestrated by NASA and other government agencies. This is so easily debunked. It's amazing that we have to have this conversation. And the only reason I'm having this conversation with my friends at the cons is so that when you hear this stuff, you can explain it to these folks. So the ancient Greeks understood that the Earth was round long before they could see that it was a sphere and that it had that spherical shape to it all the way around in every direction. They could look at, well, lunar eclipses and see the curvature of the Earth's shadow as it passed in front of the moon. And it's pretty easy calculation. They did it. They did it, 2,500 years ago. You can simply look at how much, figure out how wide the moon is. It's a half a degree of arc. And you can look at how much curvature of the Earth you see in that half a degree of arc. And you can do some pretty simple math to go, well, if you see this much of the Earth's arc over half a degree from this distance, then obviously the circumference of the Earth must be 25,000 miles. And again, this was stuff that they'd worked out over 2,000 years ago and worked out, pretty accurately with just nothing but a knowledge of geometry and some simple observation. I love this picture. This is, and again, nobody was trying to prove or disprove anything with this. This was just a photographer who took a time-lapse photograph of the moon during the night of a lunar eclipse. And you can literally see what you got there. It looks like 9 exposures, and you can easily make out the shadow of the Earth, which happens to be round, as the moon passes, or it passes in front of the moon, or the moon passes by it, depending on how you're looking at it. I've also heard it claimed that there's nowhere on Earth you can go, no matter how high up you go, that you can actually see the curvature of the Earth. Therefore, the Earth must be flat because it looks flat everywhere from a distance. That is actually not true. I went out on the internet when I first wrote this talk, and I found a picture of somebody on Everest, snapshot, and then I actually drew the tangent lines of the horizon from 35,000 feet up, whatever the height of Everest is, took the standard angular acceptance of a camera, and could show that the circumference of the Earth is 25,000 miles. So it is absolutely not true that you cannot see the curvature of the Earth anywhere on the planet. If you look closely enough, it's there. And it's not like it's that hard. I mean, any old photo will do. That was about a 3-degree difference in the tangent lines from Everest. So if you had a high enough resolution picture from an even lower altitude and you were careful about the way you did things, you could prove this to yourself just about any snapshot from on high that you had. Yet another case, I actually used this in my astronomy class, or did use it in my astronomy class a few years back when I was still teaching it, of the, ancients even knowing that the Earth was round. This idea that Columbus, thought the Earth was flat, and sold that to Queen Isabella is, I don't know where that started, because even back then, Columbus knew it was well established the Earth was round. Eratosthenes was curator of the Great Library. He worked it out a little differently. He knew that there was a well, a really deep well in Syene. If I think about it, I will tell you what Syene now is. It's still a city in Egypt, but of course it's got a different name. Damn it, I forgot. I think it's Aswar or something like that. But anyway, the Great Library was in Alexandria, and Eratosthenes worked out that, or actually he read that on the day of the summer solstice, the sun passed directly over this really deep well in Syene, and you could see the bottom of the well. You could see the water in the bottom of the well reflecting back up, but it only happened that one day of the year. So he went outside to this really tall obelisk outside of the Great Library and measured the angle of the shadow on that same day. Then, being part of the aristocracy, the Egyptian aristocracy, he was basically rich. So the next thing he did is he paid some poor fellow to step off the distance between Alexandria and Syene. He actually did a calculation. Once the distance was stepped off, he knew there was a 7.2 degree angular difference between the position of the sun in Alexandria and Syene. And he worked out to, depending on who you ask, 0.16% the circumference of the Earth. And he did this in 200 BC. Now, there is, of course, some argument even to this day about what a stadia is, because things were measured stadia back then. And so some might say 5%, some people might say 0.2%, but in any event, he came out with a damned accurate calculation using nothing but, somebody stepping off distance and crude angular measurements of tall objects. Okay, enough of that. Even at 5%, it was a good result. One of the other things that I don't know, it's weird to me that people miss this. It's basic astronomy. But one of the other things that should be fairly clear is that the reason we have seasons is because the Earth is round, spherical, and its axis is tilted. So it rotates along a tilted axis, and part of the year you get, as it goes around its orbit, you get more direct sunlight, and part of the year you get less direct sunlight. And on those parts of the year where your pole is pointed away from the sun, it's wintertime. And on the parts of the year where your pole is pointed closer to the sun, and you get more direct light at summertime. So the very fact that we have seasons, not to mention just, 24 hours in a day and the way the sun rises and sets and all that, because they've got explanations of that. But as far as I know, they don't have any explanations of the 4 seasons that we all go through. That's kind of hard to do without having a spherical planet and a tilted axis. And again, work out the math, it's simple geometry, and you figure out the average length of the day in the summer versus the winter, and it all works out with experimental observation. So what's the cause of the error for the flat Earth? Well, I think, again, it's attention-seeking and, in this case, misguided religious beliefs. Some people just, I don't know, they get the idea that scientists are just out there to fool people, and we're not trying to understand how the world really works so that we can make cool things like computers and the internet for people to argue over. But I think this goes back to a religious belief and people just not wanting to let that go in the face of real evidence, which of course is crazy to me. There are plenty of religious people that can still be religious and don't have to believe in a flat earth while they're doing it. Speaking of religious people, our next craziness is the young earth, or the creationism premise. Creationism is a religious belief that the universe and life originated from specific acts of divine creation. Okay. For young earth creationists, this includes a biblical literalist interpretation of the Genesis creation narrative and the rejection of the scientific theory of evolution. I just don't know what to say other than that's just plain unfortunate. So these people insist, and again, I've unfortunately known them. I've worked with some of them, even in a job I had, because I live in Greenville, South Carolina, and I one job in particular, I was right across the street from Bob Jones University, and so I actually had people try to tell me that they believe the Earth was 6,000 to 8,000 years old. To believe in a universe as young as 6,000 or 7,000 years old is to extinguish the light from most of the galaxy. The new Cosmos series, when it first came out a couple of years ago, actually had this picture, and I thought it was pretty cool. There's all kinds of ways that you measure distances to stars, and you know how far away they are, and that could be a talk in and of itself. But if you took all of the known stars in the galaxy, let alone the universe, and you measured their distances, and you said the universe was only 6,000 years old, then that circle in that picture would be all the light you would see. So we see a lot more than that, well beyond the 6,000, 7,000 light year limit. That's not even getting you out of our own galaxy. So the premise is just ridiculous beyond, any kind of, description. It boggles the mind that anyone alive today would even claim this. Of course, sometimes it's an attack on the ideas of evolution. And again, I think you can be religious without believing in a 6,000-year-old universe and saying that evolution makes sense. But what can you do? Sometimes people just ignore facts to believe what they want to believe. These cats share 95.7% of the same DNA, and nobody argues that they're cats. Humans, and they're all members of the cat families. Humans and chimps share 98.5% of the same DNA, but this is one of the most heavily disputed pieces of science. No matter their resemblance, they cannot see past their own ego, forgetting that they too are animals. So a lot of this religious belief, just they can't get their head around the fact that we're just other members of the animal kingdom. This is a favorite story of mine. And this is kind of how some of this even started. In 1862, the physicist Lord Kelvin published calculations that fixed the age of the Earth at between 20 million and 400 million years old. He assumed the Earth had formed as a completely molten object and determined the amount of time it would take for the near surface to cool to its present temperature. His calculations did not account for heat produced via radioactive decay, a process then unknown to science, or more significantly, convection inside the Earth, which allows more heat to escape from the interior to warm rocks near the surface. So on the right-hand side over here, you get a diagram of thorium decay from lead-212 to lead-208. Each parent nuclei spontaneously decays to daughter nuclei via an alpha decay or a beta decay. Note that bismuth-212 can either decay into polonium-212 or thallium-208. The final decay product is lead-208. It's stable and can no longer undergo spontaneous radioactive decay. Big fat hairy deal, so what? Why am I telling you all this? Well, here's the thing, and this is why it's one of my favorite stories to tell. Back in 1862, Lord Kelvin was actually the Mac Daddy of physicists. And he said, you know, I can figure out how old the Earth is through simple thermodynamic calculation. At some point, the Earth was molten rock. It radiated heat out into space. And, you know, because it's radiating heat out into the vacuum of space, it's black body radiation, and outer space is at a certain temperature, I can figure out how long it would take the surface of the Earth to cool down to the standard 58 degrees that the average temperature of the Earth's crust is just about everywhere now. So he did that calculation, and he came up with a figure like 200 million years old. Now, this already upset the religious people, because even back then they were claiming the Earth was 7,000 years old based on what was in the Bible and all of that generational information they put in Genesis about who begat whom and how old they lived and all that kind of stuff. That's an incomplete record by anybody's accounting. I mean, eventually you might follow the line down to Moses or something, but then eventually there's how many generations of offspring after him. So I don't know why a religious person would necessarily think that he could calculate the age of the Earth just based on what history's given him in the Bible, even if you could take that history as absolute fact. But to say the least, Lord Kelvin's 200 million year estimation already put him in a tizzy. So now something interesting, something else that's very interesting happens. The geologists at the time, and one of these days I'm going to go to Scotland just so I can look at the rock strata there, because that seems to be where a lot of this geology was first born, and the whole science of geology was born. But these Scottish geologists came along and said, you can't be right. And here's why. We've studied this granite rock that we see on the shoreline, you know, on the cliffs of Scotland. And we see these rock strata that have been bent over on themselves 180 degrees. And we know that you can put granite under a certain amount of pressure and you can bend it at a certain rate. And just looking at these rock strata that we can see on these cliffs, we know that the Earth has to be on the order of billions of years old. Now, Lord Kelvin was like, how dare you, a bunch of geologists, you know, question me? And, you know, what is this based on? How do you know this? So they explained it to him. And what was eventually figured out is that the Earth has stayed a lot warmer for a lot longer due to all the radioactive material in the Earth's mantle and in its crust. So in some sense, the Earth is a big giant nuclear reactor, and all this radioactive decay inside the Earth kept it warmer for a lot longer than it should have. One of the things that, I thought was very striking back when I was a grad student in nuclear physics was you talk about these decay chains, you talk about all the possible ways that an atom, a radioactive atom, can break down and turn into another atom and turn into another atom. And there's all kinds of variants, of course, but all the decay chains that have a total lifetime of under 5 billion years aren't represented in the Earth's soil, in the Earth's crust. And so you think there's these, ways, carbon dating or whatever that, or whatever the geologists do, that we figure out the age of the Earth. But the truth of the matter is there are multiple branches of science and multiple ways of figuring out the age of the Earth. And all of these ways point to about 4.5 billion years. So again, I don't know what to say. This idea that the Earth is 7,000 years old when we've got, in some case, even when you go to archaeology, we have relics that are older than that. It just boggles the mind. Cause of error on this one, strictly misguided religious beliefs. I don't even think it's attention seeking. I think that somebody just was told by a preacher somewhere that the Earth was 8,000 years old and it must be right. And then another personal favorite, the 9/11 truthers. Oh my goodness. Adherents of the 9/11 truth movement are considered to be conspiracy theorists who dispute the mainstream account of the September 11th attacks, 2001. The truthers, as they are sometimes pejoratively called, dispute the commonly accepted account that Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 airliners, crashed them into the Pentagon and New York's Twin Towers, whereupon the crashes led to the collapse of the Twin Towers. Truthers primarily focus on what they claim are significant inconsistencies in that explanation, suggesting a cover-up, at least complicity by insiders. They analyze evidence from the attacks, discuss different theories about how the attacks happened, and call for a new investigation into the attacks. Some of the organizations assert that there is evidence that individuals within the United States government may have even been responsible for or knowingly complicit in the September 11 attacks. Motives suggested by the movement include the use of attacks as a pretext to start wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and to create opportunities to curtail civil liberties. Support for the movement is negligible from professionals in relevant fields, such as civil and aerospace engineering. So I'm not exactly sure why the government would make a big conspiracy to blow up the Twin Towers in New York so that they could particularly attack Afghanistan and Iraq. You'd think if they were going to do something like that, I don't know, they'd come up with a better target than Afghanistan. This was a mantra for a lot of years, these guys. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams. So they say that, the burning jets could never have brought down the Twin Towers. This is a horrible misunderstanding of basic material science. Jet fuel burns at 2,190 degrees Fahrenheit, a great deal lower than the temperature required to melt steel, which is 2750. However, steel weakens as low as 400 degrees. At 980 degrees, it is already down to 10% of its strength. You don't have to fully melt the steel for it to become structurally weak. It gets bendy long before it turns into a liquid. So all it takes is the weight of the tower to unzip this thing, very much like you saw on the news when it happened. 4 novice pilots with no experience could never have successfully guided those planes into 3 out of 4 targets. Well, 4 of the hijackers were trained to fly, 1 for each flight. 3 of the 4 had trained and earned private pilot's licenses. The fourth, Annie Hanjour, had both a private and commercial license and experience in small commercial aircraft. Again, that's such a ridiculous argument anyway. My dad was a pilot. I never wanted to spend the money to become a pilot myself, but even when I was 12 years old, I used to play with the equipment and could tell him where the plane was just by triangulating on a map. Once you see New York, once you get close enough to see Manhattan, it's easy to see the Twin Towers, or at least it was before these Hanyakkers knocked them down. All were trained in autopilot navigation systems and would have only had to plug in GPS coordinates and point the planes in the right direction to hit their targets. The day was clear, the targets were clear. Experts conclude their skills would have been more than sufficient to finish their missions. And I'm telling you, I could do it. And I didn't even train for it, other than to just grow up, with my dad as a pilot. Flight 93 was shot down, relatively little wreckage at the scene, large pieces of wreckage miles away from the crash site, and evidence of a mysterious white jet in the vicinity all confirm that the government disposed of Flight 93 with extreme prejudice. Not actually sure why that would prove it was an inside job, but okay. Flight 93 flew into the ground at a steep angle at about 580 miles an hour, disintegrating most of the wreckage. What did remain, notably a large piece of engine fan, the truthers claim ended up miles away from the site, indicating that the plane was breaking up long before impact. In fact, the fan in question landed 300 yards from the site. The other small bits of paper and scrap metal floated a mile and a half and landed in Indian Lake. Truthers claim Indian Lake is 6 miles away from the crash site, betraying investigation skills hampered by Google Maps. The lake is 1.5 miles away as crow flies. It's 6 miles if you drive it. There was a small corporate jet in the vicinity at the time, descending towards Johnsonville, Pennsylvania, when the FAA ordered it to check out the area in Shanksville. Plane descended to 1,500 feet, found a smoking hole in the ground, marked the position with the plane's navigational equipment, and headed back to the airport. It was not fighter jet. Or maybe it was, but it's kind of a stretch to say that it was. And again, Occam's razor here, right? All of this stuff is easily explained without involving shooting down this jet deliberately. And so here we get to the real crux of it. This was the thing that struck me the most when I started, really delving into it. After meet our friend Dylan Avery here. After discovering Paul Thompson's Terror Timeline in mid-2002, Avery began writing the screenplay for a thriller in which a group of friends discovers a government cover-up of the September 11, 2001 attacks. A screenplay. After having been denied admission twice by Purchase College Film School and realizing that creating a full-budget feature was not feasible for an 18-year-old director, he decided instead to make a documentary. This gave rise to the Loose Change series. In 2010, Avery worked with the teacher and musician Wes Davis to create Buzzkill, a film about a 21-day project to stop drinking coffee and caffeine products. If you remember Super Size Me, Morgan Spurlock, I think was that fella's name. It's all a big thing about nutrition and how what we eat kills us. Man, that thing became wildly successful in its day. Anyway, this guy's Buzzkill documentary about caffeine is available on YouTube. You could actually watch it. In December 2012, he began editing A Field Full of Secrets, a documentary about a man who starts investigating crop circles and winds up attempting to build a UFO with a transsexual named Nicola Romansky. It was released by Gravitas Ventures on limited VOD platforms on December 2nd, 2014. He's currently making a film about injustice and police brutality called Black and Blue, scheduled to be completed in 2016. All right. So, why am I bringing this guy up? This guy has spent his whole life trying to be famous, internet famous maybe, but that's his thing. He actually wanted to be in screenplays. He actually wanted to write, I guess, on Broadway or whatever. And he didn't have the budget or probably the talent to do that. So instead, he started making these cheesy documentaries to get attention. And he's been doing it ever since. This guy right here, this fellow you're looking at right here, is the author of all this 9/11 bullshit. This is where it all started. And he's nothing but a kid trying to get attention. 9/11 cause of error, fear coupled with attention seeking and distrust of authority again. Always that distrust of authority. The governments have to get you, man. Haven't you heard? GMOs. There's a concern among the public that eating genetically modified food may be harmful. Specific concerns include mixing of genetically modified and non-genetically modified products in the food supply, effects of GMOs on the environment, the rigor of the regulatory process, and the consolidation of control of the food supply companies that make and sell GMOs. Advocacy groups such as the Center for Food Safety, Organic Consumers Association, Union of Concerned Science, and Greenpeace say risks have not been adequately identified and managed, and they have questioned the objectivity of regulatory authorities. It's always funny when conspiracy theories question everybody else's objectivity. So here's just a big meme about GMOs. There have been 1,783 studies, none of which have produced fruit as far as GMOs being unsafe. 0 illnesses, human or animal, proved as a result of genetic modification. Billions of pounds of biotech foods have been eaten. And, you know, you're actually feeding the world with it, which leads me to another remark here. This guy is always worth talking about. This guy is an actual honest-to-God scientist. And this is what scientists can do. At the time when the doomsayers were hopping around saying everyone was going to starve, Norm Borlaug was working. He moved to Mexico and lived among the people there until he figured out how to improve the output of farmers. So that saved 1 million lives. Then he packed up his family and moved to India, where in spite of a war with Pakistan, he managed to introduce new strains of wheat that quadrupled the food output. So that saved another 1 million. You get it? But he wasn't done. He did the same thing with the new rice in China. He did the same thing in Africa. As much as Africa as he's allowed to visit. When he won the Nobel Prize in 1970, they say that he had saved 1 billion lives. He fed 1 billion people with his GMOs that these people are trying to tell you are bad. So think about that. Think about how unhealthy these GMOs supposedly are, but then think that there's 1 billion extra people on the planet because of them. And that's just the contributions of one man. That's 1 billion. That's the Carl Sagan billion with a B. And most of them were a different race from him. Norman is the greatest human being, let's say one of the greatest human beings, and you probably never heard of him before today. And that's a shame. It's particularly a shame if you've ever talked to any of these GMO yahoos. If you know who they are, but you don't know who this guy is. You know, progress is real, and it's kept a lot of us alive and led to a lot of success for the human race. And you need to be careful about criticizing it, particularly when you don't know what you're talking about. GMOs, what's the deal? Again, fear. It's Frankenfoods, right? They're bad for you. Maybe. Ask those guys in India if it's bad for them. So fear coupled with attention seeking, and again, distrust of authority. And then vaccines. Oh boy, this is just, I don't even know where to start with this. Actually, I do know where to start with it. I'm looking at a slide that tells me where to start with it. Vaccine controversies have occurred since almost 80 years before the term vaccine and vaccination were introduced, and continue to this day. Opponents question the effectiveness, safety, and necessity of recommended vaccines. They also argue that mandatory vaccinations violate individual rights to medical decisions and religious principles. These arguments have reduced vaccination rates in certain communities, resulting in outbreaks and deaths from preventable childhood diseases. Evidence surrounding vaccination shows that prevented suffering and death from infectious disease outweighs any adverse effects. You've got to always look at the good side as well as looking at the bad side on anything, and that's assuming there is a bad side. Immunization programs depend on public confidence to be effective. Safety concerns often follow a pattern. Potential adverse effect is hypothesized. Premature announcement is made. The initial study is not reproduced. And finally, it takes several years to regain public confidence in the vaccine. A modern and notable example involved Andrew Wakefield's discredited claims of MMR vaccines causing autism. This is actually where this started, and that's pretty well accepted by everybody involved in the discussion. Is that this guy wrote a book about how MMR vaccines cause autism, and then suddenly all these soccer moms started saying that vaccines are bad. Public reaction has contributed to a significant increase in preventable diseases, notably measles. In 2011, the vaccine autism connection was described as the most damaging medical hoax of the last 100 years. So here we have just one article. Anti-vax mom changes her tune as all 7 of her children come down with whooping cough. When was the last time you knew somebody with whooping cough? Probably never in your lifetime. But guess what? They're out there, and you'll probably meet somebody that's got it at this point because of yahoos like this. And it seems to have started with Jenny McCarthy. That seems to be her attempt to stay famous as her fame started to decline over the years. It's really kind of sad. Where does it start? Attention seeking and distrust of authority. Notice I didn't say fear here. You have to be pretty brave to put your family at risk. Stupid, but brave nonetheless. Now, the other thing that I have not added to this talk and I have not discussed is the COVID situation, because I know that's a hot button for a lot of people. But again, before you start saying vaccines aren't effective, you need to think long and hard about that. DDT. So if we go back to the discussion of what junk science is, the fellow that originally coined that phrase was all about DDT. And I thought he made a good point. He said that, DDT, he said there's hundreds of millions of people dying in Africa because of the mosquitoes there. And the fact that we made DDT illegal, and had we not made DDT illegal pretty much worldwide, then all these people in Africa wouldn't be dying from malaria at this point. Seemed like a reasonable argument to me. In 1962, Rachel Carlson published the book Silent Spring. It cataloged the environmental impacts of widespread DDT spraying in the United States and questioned the logic of releasing large amounts of potentially dangerous chemicals into the environment without understanding their effects on the environment or human health. The book claimed that DDT and other pesticides have been shown to cause cancer and that their agricultural use was a threat to wildlife, particularly birds. Its publication was a seminal event the environmental movement and resulted in a large public outcry that eventually led in 1972 to a ban on its agricultural use and in the United States. So this is where the hippies got their foothold, right? And they must be wrong about what they're saying. Well, it turns out maybe this was correct. So some of these grassroots movements, this idea that you should question what the authorities are telling you, may actually be right. And so that's why we take the time to actually listen to these people, even when they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. Turns out this lady knew exactly what she was talking about. Malaria remains a public health challenge in many countries. 2008 WHO estimates were 243 million cases and 863,000 deaths. About 89% of these deaths occur in Africa, mostly of children under age 5. DDT is one of the many tools to fight the disease. Its use in this context has been called everything from a miracle weapon, that is, like kryptonite to the mosquitoes, to toxic colonialism, depending on who you ask. Well, it turns out that if you try to use too much DDT too often, that the mosquitoes actually develop a resistance to it, and their populations come back no matter what you do. And the effects of DDT on the birds and the environment are still valid. So what's the cause of error here? None. Perhaps just some overreaction by some lawmakers, but concerns are valid. Lack of a measured response is the biggest problem. So even the best of us can make a mistake. You can't just knee jerk and say any hippie is wrong. You do have to take the time to listen to them. Okay. Running short on time. Like I told you, I had way more slides and way more material than I had time. Fukushima, people going nuts over Fukushima because of all the radiation being released into the ocean. Okay, sure. TEPCO was allowed to dump 22 terabecquerels per year. TEPCO admitted that there was no control and it was unknown when the tritium loss had started. So the Fukushima plant is still leaking tritium into the Pacific Ocean. I've seen articles that suggest that the salmon, even in Canada, are tainted by all of this tritium making its way into the Pacific Ocean. That is a ridiculous claim, and I constantly tell people, if you're afraid to eat the salmon, if you live on the West Coast and you're afraid to eat the salmon, pack it in dry ice and send it to me. Not only will I eat it, I will give it to my dogs. If I'm willing to give it to my dogs, I think it's safe. So much misinformation about Fukushima. I love this meme. Remember the inspiring story about the Fukushima 50, the heroes who sacrificed themselves to clean up the nuclear plant disaster in Japan? Yeah, they're all fine. Exactly. None of them have contracted radiation poisoning, and their long-term prognosis is good as well. A panel of experts found the average cancer risk for the workers is 0.002% higher than the normal population. The accident wasn't nearly as dangerous as Chernobyl, despite the wildly exaggerated comparisons reported in the press. Literally nobody died in Fukushima because of the reactor. Lots of people died because of the tsunami. The reactor didn't kill anybody. So that's just explaining what becquerels are versus grays versus other radiation guides. This is just hilarious to me, particularly the graphic on the right. This has been shown time and time again. Even you see in this magazine header or this magazine page, a radioactive nightmare is a headline. Well, that map that they're showing you there, that picture with all those intensities drawn out, is actually the estimated wave height of the tsunami. That's not a radiation map. It was never a radiation map. And this is the kind of crap you have to deal with when people go nuts and start talking about Fukushima. The damage that the Fukushima plant has done to the Pacific Ocean is nil. It's a huge basin of water, and people seem to forget all of the radioactive material we dumped into the Pacific Ocean during nuclear testing back in the 50s and 60s. The cesium-137 that's in the ocean that's left over from surface testing in the 50s and 60s is greater than anything Fukushima dumped into it. There's actually, due to radioactive decay, there's actually less cesium-137 in the Pacific Ocean than there was 20 years ago prior to Fukushima. More stuff about tritium, what it is, how it works. Fukushima cause of error, fear coupled with sensationalism and distrust of authority. All right, got through Fukushima, now we're going to wrap things up. Astrology, I think we all know astrology, magnets, that's all craps. So here we go, takeaway. This is life expectancy charts, your life expectancy from 1900 to 2009, depending on where you live. This is where all these various things were introduced. Chlorine in the water, polio vaccine, measles vaccine. And you see that with all of these things, our life expectancy has gone up over time. Junk science is faulty scientific data and analysis used to advance special interests and hidden agendas. Why is there so much of it? Fear is the mind killer. Resist it. Other common causes, the need to be noticed, laziness leading to a lack of understanding, or intellectual laziness, if you will, religious fundamentalism, disregard for authority, particularly science, government, and business, the dreaded vast military-industrial complex. Just remember that vast military-industrial complex gave you most of the good things in your life, like your smartphone and the computer that you're probably sitting at while you listen to this talk. Or the vast right-wing conspiracy if your name's Hillary. And yes, money. Money is a whole lot of what's behind all of these conspiracy theories, because they could sell you books or crystals or whatever to protect you. You'd be amazed at the money some of these people make from this stuff. And there we are. We made it to the end, hopefully within our allocated hour. I'm going to cut it off there. I'm not even going to read that cute little cartoon to you. If you want to pause the screen and read it yourself, have at it. But with that, I will say thank you and good night or good day, depending on what time of the day they show this.